Hello and welcome to Varn Blog in coordination with Cyber Dandy, which this I believe will probably be released on both our channels. And we're talking about anti-communism. This is a part 2 of a series that might end up being quite long. We were just talking off air about all the different topics we're going to eventually need to kind of broach. And anti-communism is so massive that I actually think it's hard to frame it. But we're going to try. We talked about we talked about my theory that when we count the Red Scares in America, we undercount them by 5. I'm always wanting to add Red Scares going all the way back to the Civil War. But I do want to talk to you a bit. We were getting up to what we can call the classical high period of American anti-communism, which is the period right before and right after World War II. And I think a lot of people know this history, but what I don't think people get is that anti-communism in America and anti-communism in Europe looked very different. And it was actually the kind of Americanization of European anti-communism that tamed European anti-communism quite a bit. So it was no longer crypto or explicitly fascist. But I mean, you see that in the movement of Thatcherism in its not full embrace of stuff like the British National Party or the National Front, and the center-right politics of France, being able to beat back the various Le Pen coalitions of both father and daughter over the past 50 years, particularly after Mitterrand, by adopting some anti-communist frameworks, but in the American style, as opposed to the classical anti-communist framework of basically just fascism. That's how it's kind of gone in Europe. But you want to talk about that? Why did European anti-communism take a fascist turn, given that fascism is a complicated phenomenon, which I would say is far right, but does come out of defectors from the left. Why was that the face of European anti-communism, as opposed to, say, blood and soil monarchy or ancien regimes, or even bourgeois governments?
Right, and I think that that's a really good place to start because, one of the big debate points that you see come up a lot lately is when some asshole is like, oh, fascism and communism are the same thing or whatever, because they're both socialism. But when you start getting into the history of anti-communism, the water just gets muddier and muddier. And the way I like to think about it is that during this time, nationalists realized that communism was such a threat that their nationalism became genocidal, is really the way that I look at it. And
but also competitive with communism in a way that it had not been before, right? The ancien regime, blood and soil. I don't want to say that it had never occurred to people to be genocidal in Europe before communism, because I mean, the British Empire was a thing, right? But and the French Empire and the Spanish Empire, and to a lesser degree German colonialism, which really never got off the ground, but tried to.
Right.
But at the same token, the idea of being internally genocidal, to me, is interesting because it does seem like a natural result of bourgeois consolidation of the national projects in the 19th century, but they didn't ever really go there in the with exceptions. I mean, like one of the exceptions is of course the sorting out of the Ottoman Empire in the early 20th century.
Mm-hmm.
And the United States' indigenous policies / some of its Jim Crow policies, which were also, models for European nationalists, and this has now been acknowledged and written about even by liberals, but it's something that's been known really for a long time and just downplayed.
So let me say it in a slightly different way.
Okay.
I think communist atheism had terrified the nationalists,
Mm-hmm.
and I don't think they would have been as strongly genocidal without that threat to Christianity.
Right. Well, my theory. My theory is the development of capitalism and the end of the feudal local lordism into absolute states and the beginning of absolute monarchies, mixed with having to try to gain property and primitive accumulation in places like Spain and England, and Portugal, led to Christendom becoming whiteness pretty quickly.
Mm-hmm.
And that kind of begins. I mean, if we were talking about the 1950s, and flash, we go back to 1455, but that kind of begins with the Seljuks and the Ottomans finally breaking the Byzantine Empire and ending Christendom as a clear and political multi-ethnic religion, and limiting it to what would be white ethnicity. So the only thing that a lot of these ethnicities shared is that they were European. And then how could you define European? Over time, as you started expanding outside of the physical territory of Europe, which, all these new empires, and in the case of England, old empires did immediately. As soon as Spain is consolidated, and then the Netherlands starts putting up a fight, the conquistadors go to the Americas. Like, it's like almost instantaneous. And you also have the first time of like Muslims and Jews being racialized in the concept of new Christians, Moranos, and Conversos.
Right.
And then also because of taking advantage of the North African Arab slave trade, and then the Congolese slave trade of the Congo Empire, you had Portuguese traders buying people who potentially could have already been Christians. So you had to justify that somehow. You couldn't justify it religiously anymore. How do you justify the slave trade? Well, you justify it in a new racial category, which the Portuguese did. And I mean, there's books and books on this. Even Abraham McKindy talks about it. Why is that important, though, for talking about like the 1940s and 1950s, right? Like that seems very far away. That's 500 years. What I find interesting, if you like, it's not like there weren't racist ideas in Europe in the 19th century. There absolutely was. Most of them were French or English, but
right.
But and that makes sense because they had the empires. Belgians probably contributed, but the French and the English really contributed the theoretical groundwork, and then the Germans came kind of late, but added a whole lot by taking language groups, because this is what the Germans really contribute, and pretending that they are racial groups. Now, why is this interesting for understanding, fascism and how the threat to Christianity is driving this? Because I think the European creation, moving from an ethnoid to a racial conception, was beneficial for settler reasons, but also as a way to fight back against disunity as Christianity becomes not the unifying cultural identifier of Europe, and that after 200 to 300 years of Protestant Catholic violence and outbreak, really breaking that up anyway, you start seeing this morphing of WASP, which is really as much a religious category, in America as it is a racial one, but it is both, into white. All right. Incorporating first people like Scottish and German Catholics, and then expanding until like the off-whites in Southern Europe get involved too, etc. And this seems to really scare the shit out of reactionaries in Europe. And what's interesting is they start, except in the case of Germany, they don't start out as the fascists. That's what's interesting about, like, if you look, I've talked about this. This episode will be out when I talk about the German conservative revolutionaries, and then I've also mentioned classical fascism, like pre-Nazi fascism in Italy. Yes, there are like there are selective. There are selective racial hatreds and whatnot. But okay, there are selective racial hatreds and whatnot, but there are not, like, it's very limited. It's limited to mostly anti-Judaism, but the whole new Christian thing is not actually universalized till the end of the 19th century. And then you have all these expansions of the categories of race. But like Italian racial hatreds, for example, are very, very like specific. Like they're against the Ethiopians and they're against certain groups of nearby Slavs, like the Albanians and I guess the Croatians across the water, right? But you don't have like a generic fear of Italian blood pollution like you do in Germany. That actually comes later, and it comes kind of slowly, and eventually in the coalition with the Nazis, it becomes more explicit. There's other weirdnesses like you do have a lot of like European, like the Phalange has an anti-Jewish contingent, but they're not concerned about Jewish blood at all. They're only concerned about like explicit Jewish ethnicity, which is more like, what you'd expect anti-Judaism to have been in Europe priorly. So however, does this get linked to the communist? Christianity ends up being a weird, like race-shaped hole, like in the European consciousness, and it's a very slow crisis, and secularism doesn't really trip it off initially. Although that is what leads that Cornel West is not wrong when he talks about like how that leads to the beginning of racial ideology in Europe, and when combined with bourgeois developmental trends and with the beginning of settler colonialism and the expansion of like bullion markets and mercantilism and this and the other, you do get an idea of race. And I went over how that happened. What I find interesting about fascism, though, is a lot of formerly Christian reactionaries cynically use it, and they're not initially part of it, except kind of in the German case. Like the German case is a little different. But even in the German case, it's strange because one of the things that focusing on race does unites Catholics with Protestants in Germany, which have traditionally been like sub-ethnic divisions within the German peoples. It's one of the things that divides up, like, say, Phrygians versus Hessians versus Prussians versus Bavarians versus Tyroleans, etc.
Right.
Burgundians, I guess that's kind of France, borderline. But you know, like, so in these national consolidation projects, they kind of hit a wall with communism, because communism really does seem to be atheistic, but not just on the level of elites, because they don't really care if elites don't believe in God.
Right.
Like, it doesn't matter if Baron de Holbeck doesn't believe in God. Like, not after French Revolution. It really seems to matter. And these ideas, but what's interesting about it that makes it different is, like, it does, like, you see the talk of race and ethnicity and nationality as like some fundamental identity as early as de Maistre. Like, so right after the French Revolution is where you really start seeing that. And then by like Gerbenu, and I'm sure I'm butchering that name, French speakers, you start seeing these theories of biological race that get kind of refined in England and Germany. But what's interesting about like early fascists like Sorelians and whatnot is, like, they don't actually believe their own anti-Semitism at first.
Yeah. Well, here's sort of like some of the what I look at it. So what is the like legal or philosophical foundation for statehood or nationality? If you examine that question, you move, originally you have these feudal states, obviously, but they're threatened by the national idea of peoplehood, like a nation, and its people are the foundation of a state. But that still includes religion. It's not necessarily humanistic to the point of excluding Christianity. So you're still able to have nation states, and especially like in Britain, where you maintain a royalty that ultimately are founded on religious ideas. But what happens with socialism and the sort of humanism that comes out of it is it becomes more and more atheistic, and the foundation for the state becomes more universal, which is the working class. Mm-hmm. And I think that at an ideological level, it's that shift away from something that could be like God's country to there's no real foundation except for solidarity among workers across, whatever continent or landmass. And that becomes such a threat that anti-communism is also a militant defense of the original foundations for nationality. Is sort of
mm-hmm. So to maintain the national projects in the bourgeois sphere, particularly with the decline of religion, you need something else to do it. Either enforced religion, enforced ethnicity, etc.
Right.
And we have to remember that where the fascist movements were the strongest were the states where national identity was the newest.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it is not, not only were these states vulnerable to the economic deprivations of World War I in particular, but they're also, like, most of them are only unified like 30 to 40 years before World War I.
Right.
Italy, Germany, Romania, a lot of Eastern Europe, and you see these borders, Poland, the Polish Republic. You see these borders actually shifting constantly in this time period. You have this mass immigration of Russian whites into Central Europe. By whites, I don't mean white racials. I mean whites as in non-Bolsheviks, who a lot of whom bring the foundations of a lot of anti-Judaism back, and mix it in with local anti-Judaism. There's a couple of good books on this. You have this racial ideology, and then you have these socialists who see the nation state, not, or at least the national identity, and that's kind of crucial because they're not always statist even, as so crucial that they're willing to do stuff like, well, we got to fight the bankers, and we're just going to encourage anti-Semitism, even though we don't really even believe it, to build an anti-banking movement. And, I mean, Sorel explicitly did this, even when he was still, praising Lenin when he was alive. So you see that in southern France and Italy. And that is interesting to me because basically what you have is three things. You have a class basis for these things. It's weird. That's the other thing we haven't mentioned. But the class basis for fascism is strange.
Right.
It is the working poor, but not the proletariat working poor. So petit bourgeois, former peasants, people who've been kind of fucked out by modernizations of these countries.
Right.
It's like petty aristocrats, and it's not particularly successful mid-sized bourgeois who are their initial bases, and then a core of intellectuals who are formerly socialist in a lot of these cases, are formerly syndicalist, depending on where you're at, right? Like the national syndicalist movement and all that. Now, what's interesting though is that doesn't, even though you have all these socialists coming over to that side, that doesn't actually indicate at all that the socialist base went with them. Most of the socialist base stayed where it was at, or went to the communists, which was kind of a new faction in a lot of these places.
Right.
And then you have the emergence of social democratic anti-communism.
Mm-hmm.
But it's really hard to maintain because like if you like the Leninists aren't wrong. I mean, they'll call Kautsky renegade, but except on colonialism, they have very similar theories going up to 1917 on how socialism should be developed, what it should actually mean. And the division between socialist and communist is in Europe sort of a division between, well, basically you shot at me during this revolution, or you killed X leader, or you sat on your hands while this other faction of your group killed X leader, which is actually what happened. Like Kautsky left the Social Democratic Party before, like, you have Ebert going out to slaughter the communists. But this leads to the socialist world and the Marxist world and the anarchist world too just totally splitting. Like, so there's no unity there. And yet they're still terrifying the ancien regimes because they've seen what's happened in Germany. They've seen what's happened in Russia. They know that also like the Habsburgs are on the way out, right? Like, so, and I think people know they can't revitalize these movements with these old monarchies anymore, right?
Right.
Where the monarchies are a little stronger, Spain, Britain, to France is the odd person out here, but you see the monarchists actually being moderating figures and kind of stopping the fascist inclination, because fascists actually aren't particularly pro-monarchy.
Right, which is interesting. It's weird because, I mean, you have Hitler talking about the Third Reich, and you have Mussolini, unifying Italy and wanting to be the new king or whatever, or replacing the king. I forget exactly how that worked. But
he wants to be the dictator replacing the king because I mean, interestingly, it's a non-Republican neoclassical reference, and they don't want the medieval stuff because they see that as degenerated. Right.
But anyway, I mean, all the European stuff, like, we sort of have to table it as much as we can, because a lot of it
doesn't
is,
matter in America.
exactly. Yeah.
Like,
Once the way anti-communism develops in America is so different because it's just such a simpler history politically, and um, and all socialism in America is seen as foreign to begin with. So whether we're talking about the pre-World War II Red Scares or we're talking about uh, after World War II, socialism never loses its uh, reputation for being something foreign to the country.
right. I mean, in some ways that makes sense because America is a fundamentally like yeoman proto bourgeois nation that becomes a bourgeois nation very quickly, and its republicanism is tied into what Marxists and most anarchists I think would also see as bourgeois revolutions of a very mixed character. Like there are so I mean one of the things that I like to point out, there are socialist elements in parts of the American Revolution going all the way back that are not foreign, but they're also kind of inchoate and weird, and they're never popular. And the socialisms that are popular, and there are many before Marxism, Owenism is actually pretty popular in the United States. 40Aism is pretty popular in the United States. They never totally catch on.
So one of the big factors, so there's two things here. One is that the threat of socialism in the United States used to be in the form of there's a lot of migrants coming over from Russia and Germany, and et cetera, and they're bringing socialism with them. That gets transformed after World War II into there's spies working for the Kremlin, right? And that's the way the foreign aspect of it transforms. But then the other big factor,
when American liberalism is put in crisis by the Russian Revolution too, like we have to admit that, like they don't, it's not that it's all initially anti-communist. They really can't figure out what to do with it. Like Christopher Lash's dissertation is on American liberalism and Russian Revolution, and they're just baffled because there's an anti-Russian sentiment in America, but the traditional anti-Russian sentiment in the 19th century in America is that it was super backwards and super reactionary. Whoa. So when it's a home of a revolution, but it's not a bourgeois one like in France, we're like, I don't even know what to do with that. Like,
and there it wasn't like automatically rejected by the elites either in America.
No.
Part of what actually helped build post-World War II anti-communism was anti-German sentiment, even more than anti-Russian from World War I. That was still in the air. But the other big thing is the AFL and the way that the AFL put themselves on the side of anti-communism, which gave labor history in the United States the character that it still has.
Right, which was after the 1950s when the AFL-CIO merged. They merged before that, but in the 40s when the AFL-CIO merged, it's like not even a decade before the AFL is able to use the CIO's own leadership to purge all its communist and anarchist.
Yeah, well, and also the AFL was accusing the CIO of being communist before the merge. I mean, so
even though it was led by a Republican, John Lewis. So
the anti-communism in the American labor movement is also, it's interesting because it's very political. And by that I mean it's not like deeply philosophical. There's a lot of like chess going on. And it just seems to make no sense if you don't if you don't understand the anti-communist element.
Right. I think that's. I mean, I think what's so interesting about this is anti-communism in the form of like the John Birch Society really did fundamentally change American religion. Now, it's not like the churches were pro-communist in the 20s and teens. They were not. But it is important to remember that like conservative, like the American like bourgeois conservative before the 1940s is really represented by someone like Clarence Darrow, the Scopes Monkey trial defense lawyer, and H.L. Mencken. They see themselves as like liberals, but liberals of the, the old Republican order. They flirt with racism, but they, lynching's too far for them. And you see this particularly in Mencken. And the progressives are strange in the United States. Well, actually, we shouldn't call them progressives yet for the most part. The progressive movement is kind of an elite movement until the 1930s. The socialist, the workerist, and the populist are strange because, for example, William Jennings Bryan is one of their key political leaders. He's one of the ends of what would become the progressive part of the Democrats. He's a fucking fundamentalist. Like, he's also, however, like proto-MMT in a lot of ways. He's okay with socialism. And it's really in the kind of low church Protestant churches before the fundamentalist movement where you see most of the kind of things that are endemical to socialism, but not explicitly so. Like, this really changes, though, in the beginning of the Great Depression and really, really changes in the late 40s and 50s. Like, and you see that that's all the cynical plays that Eisenhower, who we have some evidence that Eisenhower didn't even really believe in God. He was baptized very late in life. He may be one of our, secret atheist presidents.
Yeah.
But he's the person to put under God on every fucking thing. Like his admit, I mean, that was when they really started playing up, a quasi-Christian identity to the United States and really purging like liberal and socialist friendly parts of the New Deal and earlier. Like, I mean, famously the writer of the Pledge of Allegiance didn't put under God in it because he was a socialist and he was a secularist.
Yeah, let me just put a pin in it so we could remember to come back to the New Deal. But keep going.
Yeah, so I mean, you have this, and what's interesting is the Birchers kind of do something that you haven't seen before. If they take the paranoid style in American politics, which I do agree with Richard Hofstadter, kind of always been there. I mean, his explanation for it's kind of like isolational, like all the settlers, once you get out of the East Coast, you're alone.
Hofstadter, the one that wrote Anti-Intellectualism in America? Okay, yeah. Great book if anyone hasn't read it.
It's a great book. It's a 50s book, but it's a great book. And his book, the Paranoid Style in American Politics, talks about how like the settler project, he doesn't call it that, but like he calls it like the settlement of the American West, because it encourages social isolation and because it happens and effectively it is an exterminationist politic, like that's in a lot of competition with other groups, that it actually encourages paranoia.
That book I haven't read.
And the Birchers find a way to combine all of it.
Yes. Yeah. And I was even going to bring up anti-intellectualism as a big component in this too. But the Birchers are a good way to talk about all of these components. Yeah. So getting back to the New Deal, though, which is roughly the time period we left off more or less last time, one of the reasons anti-communism becomes so foundational to American politics is because of the way that the New Dealers were always accused of being communists. And then later, anti-communism was used to tear away the gains made through the New Deal, right? So the whole entire free market movement, the Libertarian Party, all of that stuff is immediately responding to the New Deal and embracing anti-communism as one of like the foundational ways of doing that. And so, yeah, along with like the Birchers and a bunch of other groups that bring the fundamentalist Christianity into it and create that wedding between the bourgeoisie and the fundamentalists, that really is a lot of what is at the heart of American politics today, whether you're for it or against it.
What's interesting to me to think about, because one of the things that they immediately do is attack Eisenhower, and like they even though their ability to do this in some ways is that, you know, during the early stages of the Cold War, we pivot towards using Christianity as a united cultural identifier, and then we expand it to Jews, but only to Jews.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's not Abrahamics, it's Judeo-Christian, right?
And
like,
also not really Orthodox Jews, but
right.
Reformed, not going to raise a fuss about the hyphenated Judeo-Christian thing.
Right.
And yeah, as the Judeo-Christian values thing, which would be a whole nother episode if we wanted to get into that. But
yeah, that's a mess. But you have this sort of like liberal Protestant consensus that is like, okay, and we'll take the Catholics now, and we'll take the cool Jews, and we'll take assimilationist blacks and some Latinos, and that's about it. But only some of the Latinos. We're also going to do Operation Wetback, and you know. But what's interesting is the Birchers managed to chip away at this, and the way they do it the most effectively actually is a mixture of pushing fundamentalist religion. And by the way, they modeled their organization structure off of the Bolsheviks. They saw themselves as using fire to fight fire.
Yeah, I read that too. Yeah,
like,
the most prominent anti-communists in America, them included, did that. They really said, they were outright saying that we need to use communist tactics against the communists and that kind of thing.
So you have them chipping away at this, and at the same time, that liberal consensus through things like the Congress for Cultural Freedom, through the establishment of FA programs and art programs, through the OSS, and then the CAA, literally trying to fund both. I mentioned this before, and it never ceases to amuse me. And if people want to read more on this, read Al Filreis's Counter-Revolution of the Word and the other books of program years, which go into MFAs being established to break up artistic communities that had a kind of organic, even though they were Champagne socialists, they were Champagne socialists in working class parts of town.
Yeah.
Like, if we think about where like Greenwich Village was in the, you know, in the teens and 20s, that is not that removed from ethnic and working class parts of New York. And that's where you see these enclaves pop up everywhere. The program stuff was designed to break up those communities. But then what is hilarious is, and I told you this off air, but we have evidence that the CIA was also funding the protest against them and against abstract art as also being communist. So you had the entire spectrum of American politics in a way. Labor's trying to prove it's not communist. The Democrats are trying to prove they're not communist. So that's when you get the emergence of the Skip Jackson Democrats and the weird detente with the communist and like the Dixiecrats start to erode. And what the Birchers really sees in on is a lot of the beginnings of the civil rights movement comes out of CPUSA organizing in the South, which is then incorporated into the New Deal. And it is true, for example, like the Black Folk Arts thing, like collective in the Smithsonian, that was started by communists and stuff like that. They're able to use that and use stuff like, say, like Robert Kennedy meeting with Lorraine Hansberry, who is still a CPUSA member at the time. The fact that almost every Black intellectual has some relationship in the 50s and the 40s to the Communist Party. Well, people don't ever ask why. And that's because the communists didn't discriminate on who they made into like arts bosses and stuff. So you had a lot of CPUSA money going to actually give like Black activists something close to a middle class life. And they were, them and the NAACP were the only people doing it. And frankly, the CPUSA people were better at it.
And the Southern Democrats specifically were targeting the civil rights movement with anti-communist red baiting as one of their major tactics to try to prevent civil rights.
So you had these Dixiecrats who have been priorly, other than their racism, somewhat sympathetic to progressive and mild social democratic reforms, which I think is often missed. It is of no small importance that the Kingfisher, who for all of his corruption and some even say make proto-fascism, he actually was not anti-Black. So for those who don't know who the Kingfisher is, Huey Long was coming out of that Southern populist tradition. After he shot, you don't ever see that again. The Southern populists almost all take, like Lester Maddox and all this other stuff, they all take explicit racist tactics to kind of stay in power. That's true with Lester Maddox. That's true with George Wallace in Alabama. And yes, some of these people eventually try to make pivots, but they're not very convincing. But they move then from like populism. Now, admittedly, Huey Long was anti-communist too. Again, pretty much everybody is, but he's not anti-socialist entirely. And that shift in the South is pretty profound because what happens immediately in the South, public sector unions are made illegal. All those right to work laws that spread in the Sun Belt and the Midwest later were all pioneered in the South as part of suppressing the civil rights movement. That's why the South has never been unionized. And then you also then had all these, frankly, children of planters and occasionally some Black bourgeoisie who are allowed to get up to use this as a way to suppress their workers, because the South became a kind of internal colony to Northern development in the early 20th century. It was the home of the textile mills. It was a home of like shit farming and sharecropping to an extreme degree. It has always been the regionally poorest part of the country, and people say, "Well, it's because they're backwards." Well, why are they backwards?
Right.
Like, I say this as a Southerner, but like, why is that the case? And on top of that, you kind of had the whole South being used as an internal colony, and you have Black people in the South being used as an internal colony within an internal colony. Like they, but it is true that I think in like the 1930s, the average Black worker in the North who had a union job made more than the average white worker in the South. I'm like, we don't even want to talk about how much better they were doing than the average Black person in the South.
Yeah. Well, so yeah, there's actually a whole book on the Southern Red Scare called Black Skin Red Scare, I think. Let me look that up real quick. I don't want to confuse that with Fanon's work.
Or the DNA guy's work. red skin, white mask. I think
Yeah.
There's so many plays on that.
I'll look it up later. I have the book, but I didn't. I was gonna
The
try to
black
read it
and red.
before.
I think it's the black and red scare in the 20th century.
You know what? Hold on. I'm just gonna go look at it real quick.
All right.
It's Black Struggle Red Scare.
Black struggle, red scare. Okay.
A lot of common words that is not easy to Google search. So yeah, it's a pretty massive subject on its own. So what I think it's important to talk about all of this right now because we still have this fundamental anti-communism that is at the heart of American ideology. And it comes out through the way we talk about Russia still, the way we talk about China still. It was
for all the rehabilitation of socialism, we still talk about Russia in Soviet terms, which is absurd.
Yeah. Our policies in the Middle East and the way that we think about the Middle East, even though that structure was transformed into Islamophobia, it was sort of built off of the un-American, anti-Christian sort of fears that were already around from the Cold War and before. And we live in a really interesting time where for the first time since like the early 20th century, people in America are able to call themselves socialists and
some degree even communists without freaking people out.
Yeah. And
but we still, what's weird is you're right though, we still have this fundamental anti-socialism, anti-communism everywhere, even amongst the young, in ways they don't, I think, totally understand.
Yeah, and so much of it has been made objective and institutionalized and impacted the real like organizational structure of the United States, whether it's labor or civil rights or whatever else, that you don't even have to overtly say anti-communism or talk about anti-communism anymore for anti-communism's history to still be impacting the world that you live in, especially if you're an not an anarchist, an activist.
An activist, yeah. I mean, I think this is fundamentally interesting, right? Democrats still, even though they're in league with socialists and complaining about semi-fascists, they're also at the same time still putting socialists on list of potential targets for terror observation and investigation. You see that even people who are literally in socialist organizations will still sometimes use anti-communist framing without realizing it. In the way they talk about, say, Russia or Ukraine, or not so much China, although red baiting with China is pretty consistent. And it makes it hard in many ways to even talk about these societies honestly, and I say this as a person who commentates on geopolitics, because you don't want to like give ammo to rabid anti-communists and xenophobes.
Right.
But you also can't like not say true things like, well, China doesn't even have socialist medicine, man. Or like, yeah, Putin selectively likes Stalin, but he wants to piss all over the Leninist legacy and says so in speeches all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And yet I can still read a book written in 2022 that blames Putin for never giving up his Soviet whatever. And I'm like,
yep. it's also, I mean, it's funny to see sometimes too, like with the last presidential election, where you know the Democrats are just so used to being able to red bait that they were utterly baffled when they would try to do it and it wouldn't work when it came to Bernie Sanders. And there's and another interesting thing too is that just the way that BLM and Antifa, um,
Well, for a little while, Antifa was used as a proxy for talking about Mark. I mean, they made it explicit later. Like you see, some like Christopher Rufo, who writes for the Manhattan Institute, who will say Marxist critical race theory, which makes me fucking laugh because
right.
I'm like, do you know who the critics of critical race theory were on the left? Because they were Marxists. Like
Yes.
that's usually who criticizes them. Um, and you know, it moved from cultural Marxism because basically the liberals were able to say, well, cultural Marxism sounds a lot like cultural Bolshevism, and like that was just code word for Jews, which it was. And now you know you see cultural Marxism being revised, and it's kind of frustrating because I'm always like, don't blame me for liberal crap, like frankly, like I'm not the person bringing Foucault into your life, like, but you know, on the same sense, I realize they don't know what else to do. Like the anti-communist witch hunt and associating minority groups with that, which you see right now with trans people,
Exactly.
with in schools and whatnot, really works. And we're in kind of a great vibe shift again, and it's a rightward vibe shift, but it's a weird rightward vibe shift. By that I mean I was looking at stats. I literally actually before I started recording this, and this is going to date people who watch my show because this will come out simply after this. But I was recording something on the most recent Pew and Morning Consult stats, which indicate that fewer and fewer people identify with leftism or liberalism, but almost none of them are identifying as conservative either. So while the Roe versus Wade and the explicit racism and like the I would consider like post-fascist semi-Bonapartism of like Trumpism has scared a lot of people, and they're not going back to the GOP as it is right now. They are abandoning the left, and increasingly, I mean, and by the left, I don't mean like they're abandoning the Democrats. I mean, they're abandoning associations with liberals, leftists, and progressives explicitly.
Okay.
And I find that interesting because what it tells me is the great Overton window shift about socialism was very thin.
Mm-hmm.
We bought back the Cold War framing for a while, but it's not sticking. I don't know that socialism is ever going to be a scare word again, but that's an interesting problem. And I do think there's a long history of anti-socialism here. And the other thing is, in some ways, the anti-socialism of like the Tea Party or the anti-communism of the Tea Party and of like second-tier Trumpists and whatnot is so hyperbolic that in some ways they did sort of like help us by calling everything fucking socialist.
Yeah. Which is just them relying on their old rhetoric. Like,
right.
Neo-Nazis have been calling themselves anti-communists for my whole life, and certainly before then. And
right. Well, there's always that whole dance, like we can't be socialists, so we can't be Nazis because Nazis are leftists. But
yeah,
sure, whatever, man.
But yeah, I mean, there is definitely, there's always going to be this. We've talked about this before. This religious fear of socialism, and by that I mean religious people being afraid of socialism. And this is what we haven't talked about yet: is that there's some not too bad reasons for the for Christians and other religious people to be afraid of communists.
Yeah. I
because
mean, not even like not mentioning like the Spanish Civil War, the Cristero War, etc. Because communists have killed priests. Although usually the context for that is specific. It is not generally because they are priests. It is generally because they exert legally exceptional political power. And so in more secularish societies where there's a stronger barrier between church and state, in certain liberal societies, there has not been, mass slaughtering of the religious. And in fact, one of the things I argue when I talk to communists, I'm like, well, complete bans on religion or strong bans on religion tend to backfire.
yeah,
The biggest example of that is the lightest hand on religion in the Warsaw Bloc was probably in Prague, and in the Czechoslovakia, or it's now Czechia and Slovakia, and those areas are the most secular still to this day of the former Warsaw Pact, whereas religious persecution was the most intense in Russia itself and in Poland.
yeah.
I mean, like you could just look, like,
But it's blown out of proportion, but it's not unfounded.
right.
And
Yeah, I mean, if we make things better, also religion's just less popular, just in general. Like,
and there's a lot of I've had conversations with nationalists and fascists and neo-Nazis throughout my life, and a lot of what their ideological development seems to go back to is that they were good Christian kids growing up, and they were taught everything that I was taught about the Holocaust in school and about how bad Nazis were, but they weren't taught anything about communist persecutions of religions, whether it's Tibetan or Christian or whoever else. And eventually, when they learned about that, or when they started becoming like adolescent and adult, and having to figure out how they could be Christian politically, that is when the anti-communist ideology got involved and helped them develop into straightforward neo-Nazis.
mm,
And so there's this
right.
dynamic that happens where that surprise that there was an atheist country, or there were atheist countries officially, and those atheist countries outlawed religion, and that is like, for those type of people, that is like the historical trauma that they identify with. Whereas, for me, it's the Holocaust of one of them, or, like anarchist persecution I'll identify with, or things like that. For them, that's their big one. It's the communist persecuted Christians. And
Right.
once that seeps in, and then they get exposed to all the things that call themselves anti-communists, which are mostly on the right wing by name,
Right.
that
I mean,
encourages them to become fascists and neo-Nazis.
right. The liberal form of anti-communism, which is conciliatory to some types of socialism or whatever, historically, whether it be use of the Frankfurt School, like of social democracy, willingness to deal with Keynesianism and things that look socialist, even if they're not. That is seen as too much of a concession. That's like it's and that's been interesting in American religion, because there's demographic stats that back that up. As the evangelicals are fading, all right. So one of the things I've been telling people is this evangelical push you're seeing is not the strength of the moral majority like you saw in the 70s and 80s. This is them becoming something else, something dangerous, but it's like a cut bear pushed against the wall.
Mm-hmm.
And you can look at that because, like, the rise of religious identification has stopped. It's actually declined precipitously since 9/11. We now have 20% not identifying with religion at all. You have an increase in people willing to admit that they're atheists. And then if you look at church attendance and not just not just self-reported affiliation, you see a bottoming out. So what that has meant is evangelical churches, particularly white ones, used to have a fairly broad range of political opinion within, no communist, but within limit. That has stopped.
Yeah.
And pretty much after Trump, the only people who are really still there are the most diehard, but they're socially actually kind of weak because their agenda is not actually being enforced by them. It's being enforced by like reactionary Catholics. Like
Yep.
that's and Orthodox Christians. That's who their thinkers are now. That actually indicates to you a social movement that is dying, but because it is dying, it is taking a militant pose, and is also likely, as we said, to posit in that Christ-shaped hole a big white mass.
Okay. So here's what isn't dying though, which is liberal anti-communism.
No, it's still fine. It's still kicking, even amongst people who call themselves socialists, as I said before.
Yeah. So someone like Destiny, the YouTuber, I see, or like the popularity of I consider him, a pretty hardcore centrist liberal. But you see that without them having to say they're anti-communist, their ideology is fundamentally based on comparisons with an anti-communist outlook.
It's not just comparison to the Soviet Union, it's a comparison to the absolute worst shit the Soviet Union ever did, and some stuff it didn't actually do.
Right. And that's going to be an interesting thing to try to fight, because the MTV generation, which I consider myself a part of, and I'm probably you.
Yeah, anybody who is in this weird older millennial, younger Gen Xer cohort, we are actually in a very weird place because we remember before any, like I was talking to you earlier, like I've been a Marxist since 2007. But I would not say I was a communist till probably about 2014 because it was dangerous.
Yes.
Like it, it was legitimately dangerous. Now no one cares, which I also somewhat think is a problem, but that's a different problem.
But it's still dorky. It's not cool.
No, it's not cool.
Because cool was monopolized by the libertarian California ideology types,
which has kind of, the libertarian part of that has collapsed, but it's gone in many different directions, and that's the interesting part of it. Like,
it's exactly the free market. Like, they're not all about the free market, but their anti-communism is still there and still remains.
I mean, you see this in the rightward drift of Elon Musk, really. Which I know people don't have long memories, but 7 years ago, he was a cool, hip, liberal tech evil person who wasn't evil. He was like the good one, and Bezos was the kind of scary one, but at least he was a Democrat. And you see all this shift, and as I told you, I think it's working. Like, I think there's other things driving it, honestly, and there's also the failure of socialists to do anything. Even though there's 120 DSA candidates elected to the office, that like the fundamental platform, the rhetoric of the Democratic Party has changed, but what they actually do really hasn't.
But a lot of this too is still like the 1970s anti-totalitarian movement, like new liberalism, that a lot of it comes from France, but a lot of our philosophy that people are talking about now comes from that period, where like Raymond Aron And
you have Ribbon on one end, and then you have Baudrillard and the ex-communist on the other.
yeah, and then but also like the new left and like people like Hannah Arendt, like
Mhm.
all these, that whole subject of anti-totalitarianism in a lot of ways is like humanist anti-communism.
Right.
And that is sort of what I think the cool ideology is right now.
What I find interesting, though, I think what's interesting is like it's the anarchists convincing the Marxists that the anti-totalitarians are all bad, which is funny because I actually agree with you. What I've always found interesting about that, though, and I think you and I were talking this last, Aaron. I think one day you and I just need to do a show just on this. I can talk about this a long time. Is in America, for example, for a long time, the Trotskyist, the most left wing Maoist, like the almost the Cultural Revolutionist sympathetic Maoist,
Mm-hmm.
um, and elements of the anarchists, social anarchist, post left anarchism, um, these kind of ideologies, a lot of whom have become like worldwide, Trotskyism's basically collapsed in like 10 years. Like, and it was actually growing in dominance in the 90s into the aughts, into the early aught teens. And we just seen it plummet.
Yeah, what the hell happened to that? That's so weird to
Well,
me.
part of me is like, it just became obvious with the DSA that some of those sectarian divisions didn't make sense anymore because you're still arguing about, debates around how you handle the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union's been gone for a generation and a half.
Yeah.
But there's also this other element where I think there's a lot of really stupid Marxist Leninism. And it's not because you and I probably disagree on this. I don't think all Marxist Leninism, everything that ever touched Stalinism, is bad. I don't think that. You probably do. But I tend to be sympathetic to Bukharin. I tend to be sympathetic to Khrushchev. I tend to be sympathetic to Zhou Enlai. I tend to be somewhat sympathetic to to Arthur Geddes, he's not a communist at all, and he's not a Stalinist at all. But he does actually point out that a lot of the anti-communist historiography and history of the 1970s and 80s really vastly overstated the character of Stalin in the purges and how extensive the purges were. The purges were bad. The Red Purges were bad and they were real. And Stalin did sign a lot of those death warrants, but it wasn't just him. And actually, I think, and so does Ostagetti, that a lot of it's the result of what we might call in Marxist terms, from Plekhanov, Incan development, like trying to develop capitalism in like 5 years for a war economy. It's going to lead to all kinds of wild shit because you shouldn't do that. But, maybe they didn't have a choice. I don't know. I like to point out, well, it destroyed the Soviet Union so bad it only lasted 2 more generations. So I can't say it was successful. But regardless, I think what's interesting now, in response to this tacit anti-communism, you also have this birth of a new Marxist-Leninism that, like, it'll take dumber positions than even the most vulgar of the high Stalinist states would.
Agreed. Yeah.
Like it is inverted the anti-communism to differentiate itself from the the DSA, which, like, yes, they also complain about anti-communism, but like they also kind of tolerate it, and it's in its DNA too. Like, Harrington has a strong anti-communist spin, and it's in the bylaws, and they've never really got rid of them. Like they'll let you locally remove the check on being a dual Carter with a Democratic Centralist organization, but they don't actually get rid of it at the national level, and stuff like that. I find that interesting, and I also find you can really see it at a certain age of anarchist, and not talking shit here, and I'm actually not even talking about Chomsky, but like I can listen to anarchists, not just post-left anarchists. Although I remember when Bob Black personally called me a Stalinist, which was pretty funny. I forgot what I called him out on, but I think I argued that some non-immediate return hunter-gatherer tribes often had hierarchy, and he called me a Stalinist. And I was like, but that's just a fact, man. Like, read the anthropology. Bob Black. You remember Bob Black?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I know him. I've hung out with him.
He's a strange guy.
Yeah, I was actually rereading some of his stuff recently. Anyway, but that's only because I was reading Bookchin. So
yeah, well, as a side note, in the Great Anarchist Wars, as a Marxist, I used to read Bookchin and Bob Black and feel like they were kind of right about each other. But that was just me sniping from the side. So like, but there is a lot of, and I've been hinting at it earlier, the way Trotskyism has been used, even though most Trotskyists were Soviet defensists, it was used in the US kind of as a legitimate communism and communism because it was anti-communist. It was the anti-communist communism.
Right.
And while that isn't true for most actual, like Orthodox Trotskyism is Soviet defensist. They don't like Stalin, but they were largely defensive of the Soviet Union. But the forms of Trotskyism that became most popular in America, like the International Socialist League and the International Socialist Organization or the International Socialist Tendency, which split the International Socialist Organization was split off from, and then SALT replaced the SWP and whatnot as the dominant tendencies because they were more copacetic to anti-communist rhetoric until the fall of the Soviet Union. And that's because they took a third campus position. And in a lot of times I'm a no campus or a third campus too, but they took it on everything. And they took a state capitalist position, but they also took a reconciliatory stance with working with the Democratic Party and with the Labor Party sometimes.
That was actually the problems that we as anarchists organizing would always run into with a lot of the Trotskyists, is that they would wind up being shills for the Democrats.
Right. Which, to be fair, I've also found large sections of anarchists who are, but
yeah, which is a different kind of problem.
Yeah, I mean, well, right now, I've watched Reddit Chomsky become like vaguely Marxist-Leninist recently. It's been a weird time. But even Chomsky, who, criticizes the Democratic war state, but will come out and has since the fucking 80s to back whatever crap the Democrats put on, not positively, but we have to fight the Republicans. He's done that my entire life.
Yeah.
Like,
so that's true.
And so, I remember the anarchists of the alter globalization movement, and I decided whether or not I would take them seriously, not by whether or not they were Antifa or something like that, but whether or not they told me I had to defensively vote for harm reduction reasons. I'm not actually against harm reduction. I'm not actually even totally against defensive voting, if it's actually defensive and not propping up a Democrat. Like,
right. Or a lot of this shit wasn't even used for voting. It was used to jockey for a leadership position in whatever mass movement was happening at the time.
Right. And probably get some backdoor NGO money.
Yes, exactly.
Like, yeah, I was going to say, because a lot of them were still anti-electoralists, but you would get weird positions that put them sympathetic to NGOs or liberal activist organizations, etc. And so, I mean, that led to frustration. It was funny though to me when I was reading, like I remember when the Post leftists back when they were pretending to be still related to socialists, were complaining about how this was right after Bernie went up in flames, and they were complaining about how the anarchists ruined it. We had this regrowth of anarchism in America, and I was like, motherfucker! Since the anti-communist period, there's only really been ultra left Maoist, a few types of anarchists, most of whom were hostile to even anarcho-communism, and fucking non-defensive trots.
Here. A lot of what inspired,
and like primitivist and weird shit.
A lot of what led to the growth of anarchism here, though, is actually anarchists here paying attention to Spain and Greece.
Yeah,
and
where anarchists are not anti-communist,
and the Zapatistas,
right?
And that was, and then so you for this whole period, I think you're talking about. There's a lot of autonomous Marxists too, because you had Hart and Negri putting out their books, and
well, that was actually in a time period where, and this seems wild now, but in America, the line between Marxist and anarchist in the 90s and early aughts was probably the thinnest it had ever been since the First International.
Yeah, and probably one of like the most intellectually stimulating periods.
Yeah,
at least that I've lived through.
But what happened to autonomism is fascinating. What happened to it in Britain is it just became fucking Labour Party.
Well, yeah, and then there was like the anti-douche too, which were weird, right? They were like, I think, autonomous Marxist, the anti-German.
Yeah, the anti-Dutch. Yeah. They were a mixture of autonomous Marxist and Frankfurt School theorists.
Yeah.
Who became Zionist supporters.
Yes. Yeah, and like very pro-America because of it too.
Right. And you had, but I mean, it's weird to think about now because at the same time, Naomi Klein's kind of anarcho-liberal No Logo came out, and you also had Hart and Negri on the fucking New York Times bestseller list, which still to this day blows my mind because the first Marxist text I ever owned, all right, was Empire.
Really?
I got it. Yeah.
Wow, that's a good place to start. Jeez.
Well, I have a lot of critiques of it now, but also it was above my head. I was a fucking 18-year-old, like who'd never been exposed to this stuff before. But like it was, you went in and you're like, Clinton book, Clinton book, Clinton book, Clinton book, Clinton book, Chomsky book, Chomsky book, Chomsky book, one Parenti book, Hart and Negri, and it's on the New York Times bestseller list. Well, I want to pick that up. That's going to be interesting, right? Like I've read 50 Chomsky interviews by the time I'm 17, even as a working class kid. Like I remember. Do you remember those little like City Lights and other small books that were just interviews with him you could buy for like $10 at Barnes and Nobles? Like there was tons of them. Like during the 90s and aughts, he put out like 5 books a year. They were just interviews. Like
that doesn't surprise me. I mean, I was mostly like used bookstore, which is always, gonna be the used books of whatever population you live within.
Right.
So, ours is in Mesa, which is, well, the one I went to was in Mesa, which is, it's a weird place.
Well, I was in Macon, Georgia, which is not known as a progressive stronghold.
Yeah.
So, but you could find, well, that's the thing. Like when I was in the zine movement, I was adjacent to a lot of anarchists and I didn't know shit about it because I was a small town working class kid. But like I knew about gutter punk anarchists, and that just sounded like a good way to get thrush. And also I actually lived amongst them for a little while, ended up for real homeless and really resented it. It wasn't fun anymore. And then there were ultra globalizationists, and that was a weird movement. It was kind of like Occupying, like it was kind of everybody and nobody. And then I remember in my 20s, and this is when I become kind of reactionary in response to this, is like Derick Jensen, who's like,
Oh, I
yeah,
hate him.
I know, and he's uncool now, but like he was one of the hottest things
I
in
know.
left in word Churchill.
Yeah, it was better.
Better, but diehard anti-communist.
Yeah. Well, I think he was also not pro-anarchist either.
Not later, yeah. Like,
Yeah, but yeah, so both of us have that experience where it was just taken for granted, even on the radical left, that you had to start from an anti-communist position. It
right.
wasn't even thinkable to like embrace
The first
communism
time
unless
anyone started talking about Lenin was Zizek in like 2009.
yeah, you're right. I think Zizek is a lot of what has to do with this.
And then like Richard Seymour became mildly popular in left-wing circles, and Tariq Ali, who had been more out as a Trotskyist, and then sort of like was kind of like the far left of labor, was beginning to be read in America, but he'd not
David
been read in
Harvey,
America. Yeah, David Harvey
and Chris Hedges.
Yeah. Well, the thing is, Hedges was deeply anti-Marxist for a long time, though.
Was he? Oh,
yeah.
Interesting.
Like I remember even during Occupy, he was basically arguing that the Marxists and the black bloc anarchists were going too far, and this and the other.
That essay was called "The Cancer in Occupy." I actually had like a really deep, passionate hatred for that. Where'd you go?
I'm back. Okay. You actually had a really deep. Sorry, I got kicked out.
Passionate hatred for that essay.
I mean, you should have. Let's be fair. That essay pissed me off, and I'm not even a defender of the black bloc general.
Also, autonomous Marxists though were the originators of black bloc.
Well, I mean, my complication with black bloc is its context in Germany and its context at the Battle for Seattle were very, 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 very different.
Sure.
And its context in Occupy, I was like, well, what are they doing?
In Occupy, stop making as much sense because it's really a protest tactic more than an Occupy tactic.
Yeah, well, it's a protest tactic and it's a defense tactic. Like, it's a way to defend against cops.
Right.
And the logic of it made some sense at Seattle, although it became really performative and kind of got out of control in Seattle.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I was there. Like it was my first trip to the West Coast, my only trip to the West Coast until I was almost 30 years old. After that, we drove from Georgia to Seattle when I was a senior in high school. We saved up a bunch of money to do it because we were all part of this music zine movement that was,
right.
And we had heard about it through anarchist zines that were in the music scene thing. And so we went out there kind of just to see what the fuck it was. And it was very confusing. And it was the first time I heard Pat Buchanan speak in person.
Yeah, that's right. That happened basically 1 year before I really started paying attention to anything. Like Phoenix Anarchist Coalition began in 2000.
Mm-hmm.
I went to my first meeting with them in 2001. And then, so it was like right on the edge of that.
Yeah, I've told this story a million times now, but I basically did that. And I was moving more and more right-wing in my early college years.
Right.
And then I hit the Sea Island protest right after 9/11, which was supposed to be the alter globalization movement under 9/11 conditions, and hanging out in a free speech zone that was basically a not a barbed wire fence, a chain link fence with a bunch of anti-war libertarians, and that's when they got me.
Ah,
Like
okay.
that was the completion of the um like working class punk radical to to conservative,
Yep.
and then but I was never a neoconservative, and then it only took me 3 years to start realizing how fucking scary parts of that milieu were. I was exposed to Stefan Molyneux before anyone knew who he was. I was exposed to a bunch of neo-Confederates. I was
Yeah.
exposed to Joe Sobran back when he was still alive, and the works of Sam Francis. And people were passing around Julius Evola, and you know what happens once you get to Evola. And I sort of hit a wall, and I was like, around 2005, I'm like, yeah, this is some weird countercultural stuff that seems like I'm going to have to be an actual fascist to keep going down. And
Yes.
then Pat Buchanan wrote his book. There was a lot of plausible deniability about what Pat Buchanan really was in the Reform Party in the 2000s, until he wrote the book that basically was like, oh, we should have sided with Germany, or at least should have set our hands on Germany and done nothing about the Holocaust, that book. And I was like, okay, I'm out. Like, and then I got jobs in education and in the public sector, and I worked in a prison for a while, and that completely like blew all that out of the water for me. But it was a slow process, and it was like multiple things happening, culminating to right before the crash. And it's funny because I thinking about this, and what I was struggling with, to bring it back on topic, was the default anti-communism.
Okay.
Like, I was always kind of socialistically inclined, even when I was messing around with libertarians, because I was like, well, I don't trust big businesses either, like.
Mm-hmm.
And so I like had this weird like yeoman pay bourgeois republic thing in my head, which where that goes.
Yeah.
Like,
The Volk.
yeah, it's like harem folk socialism or like something like that. So it's just like, but my family was multi-ethnic. I lived in a mostly like my area was mostly black. Those are not things you can do unless you're willing to go all the way in that scenario. And also at this time, and I know this seems different now, but they still spoke in code back then.
Right.
Like, people weren't out and out saying what they say now. Like, that was back when human biodiversity was like a code for race realism. Like,
Dude, even actual neo-Nazi skinheads back then would say they were not National Socialists, and they
yes.
weren't. Like, that's how coded it was, that even the guy with that looked like he's from the Aryan Brotherhood was saying that he's just an anti-communist.
Yep. Yeah, and you would hear that all the time. Or you would hear, the other thing you would hear is like, you meet weird pagans who are folkish, and if you don't know what that is,
Yeah.
And they'd be like, well, I'm not a racist. I just believe in like different people having their traditions intact. And I'm like,
yeah, like that stupid national anarchist guy.
Yeah, Troy Southgate.
Yes.
Who I have dealt with personally.
But yeah, I mean, so even their music though was called rock against communism. Like, it's just, and
what's interesting to me
recently, some of these recent whatever you want to call them, fascist, Patriot Front, Europe, Identity Europa, whatever, there's new ones coming out that are calling themselves anti-communist.
Yeah, I was about to say, the anti-communist stuff is coming back. I've seen it also back again, like in the early aught teens, explicitly red baiting directly and calling someone a socialist was something for plebs to do, but a high class conservative working at the Manhattan Institute wouldn't do it.
Right.
That is not true now.
Yep.
It's like Ann Coulter can do it. Glenn Beck can kind of do it, but our actual intellectual elites, they don't do that. Like if you work for First Things or the Claremont Institute or the Manhattan Institute or any of those things, like the highbrow conservative think tanks, or the libertarian think tanks, you did not explicitly red bait that much.
Exactly.
That's changed. Like, although I will say this, the libertarians actually weirdly, despite calling everything communist forever, do less red baiting than a lot of the other groups, which is quite actually weird when I think about it.
Yeah,
But
it's a very weird moment right now. And I think a big part of understanding it is what we're doing is reviewing this history. And
I think if you're like, I've talked about how like boomers and Gen Xers were always more reactionary than I mean, I actually do kind of miss the progressive Gen X left, and I don't think it was reactionary inherently. But I can say, because I think partly because of the fall of communism, and partly because basically the anti-communists could brag during their early adulthood, and that even the left, even the anarchist and Marxist left, had a lot of anti-communist baggage in its own literature.
yeah,
That, and I say this is, you and I, people should understand, you and I are not Stalin apologists. Like, we're not gonna defend the Red Purges. We're not gonna say the Cat Massacre didn't happen. We're not gonna or it was secretly Nazi somehow. Like, I don't think Homodor, that word, the H word in Ukraine. Homolodor.
I don't know.
All right. I don't think that was a deliberate.
The Holodomor or whatever.
Yeah, the Holodomor.
Yeah,
I've never heard it pronounced the same way. Christ, a Ukrainian friend of mine, a Russian friend of mine, tell me how to pronounce that.
Right.
That I don't think that was a deliberate genocide. I think it was an accidental one by bad social policy. But that's hardly a defense. I also don't totally think that the British were setting out to kill the Irish in the famines either, but they were totally okay with it happening.
And then for me, I'm an anarchist. I mean, part of we haven't even gotten to this, and I don't think we'll be able to for this one, but part of my whole angle here is that, for as much as I agree with the anarchist critiques of communism, I understand the way that it comes around and bites anarchists in the ass if they red bait too much.
And I will say, Gen X anarchists tend to fucking red bait.
Yeah,
they do.
I'm guilty of having done it plenty myself. This is like a more recent realization for me, and the way that it comes back around.
Yeah, it's for me it's been a struggle too, because I mean, I part of what I want to do, one of the reasons why I oppose, all this anti-communism, is that it makes it very hard to actually really fairly critique our own movement honestly and improve it, because we're so afraid of giving succor to the enemy by saying something true about ourselves. And I actually also think it makes us look ridiculous when we start making arguments from ignorance or whatever to try to wave away stuff that's ugly about the communist past so that we can defeat the Black Book of Communism. Because frankly, the Black Book of Communism is easy to defeat without that shit. Like, it's like they're like when you see like, oh, they count on all their millions, like everyone who died in World War II, every fascist who was ever executed, and that tells you a lot. Like anyone who died of any starvation ever, regardless of the cause, like, and if I was doing that with capitalism, I would have a pretty high death count too.
Exactly. Yeah.
And this is not to say that like everything's morally equivalent. I mean, like the Soviet Union and China have both done fucked up shit. Even a communist state that I think is really defensible, like Cuba, has done some hard to defend stuff. Like,
sure.
I think they were pretty good on trials. I think they were pretty good on rule of law, actually, compared to a lot of the. But like some of what they did to homosexuals and to AIDS patients in the 80s and 90s is really hard to justify.
Yeah.
they have recanted. But but it's funny because of the anti-communist use of that, I now know Marxists who just won't talk about it, because I'm like, well, but we have to admit, like, even states that are good fuck up. Like, don't, like, if you present this as a utopia and people go and find this out, it's going to backfire on you.
Mm-hmm.
Which is why, frankly, most of you became Marxist and communist, because you realized that you were sold a bunch of bullshit for capitalist American exceptionalism.
Yeah. Well, and then there's Adam Curtis, which he's got something new coming out, but whatever.
I'm kind of worried about it, but it doesn't have a voiceover, so he can't do his normal tricks. Adam Curtis bothers me for a bunch of reasons. I've talked about it before. I enjoy him, but I realize that he uses music, images, and narration to hide the fact he doesn't have an argument with the images or the narration. And so you think you have made an argument, but there hasn't actually been one made. And I think that's, and his also equating this to that and not contextualizing it, particularly in this last one where he did some stuff with rap and the Black Panthers that I found was borderline racist, and then like totally not going into all the necessary context for China. Mm-hmm. Like, I was like, man, I could have got this from like an anti-communist book.
But he's one of the more persuasive anti-totalitarian types. Yeah.
Yeah, and he ends up in a Graeberite position. If we can imagine another world as possible, but I'm like, but you've just kind of argued that we can't, motherfucker.
I know.
Like,
and his whole thing is he's anti-individualist. He's from that interesting, like, almost conservative sort of anti-individualism. But...
Yeah, I was about to say he's somewhere between like a social anarchist and a communitarian.
Yeah.
And I think there's more, but it's funny. So many Gen X and elder millennial Marxists fucking love him.
I mean, I like that he talks about people I like to read.
Yeah, me too.
And the imagery's good, but yeah, his conclusions drive me insane.
Yeah, I mean, well,
I'm a little running out of time here, so
yeah, me too. So we'll probably do this again in a couple of months, and we'll actually I think we'll pick a topic. We really need to go back and dig into maybe an example of how this religious stuff worked in the 50s, because we did like we did the first time. Okay, we got like 100 years to cover, and it involves like 85 facets of a thing.
Right.
We're just going to talk. So
at least we covered different periods of time from the first one, though.
Yeah.
So
yeah. Well, the first one I think is more shocking to people, because I don't think people realize how far back the Red Scares in America go. They go pretty far back. So with that, we'll have another collaboration, and I'll see you again. I'm going to end us off here with an outro.
Awesome.
ضخم تبدو آثاره الانفجار الثاني وانفجارات كبيرة وهائلة، وربما هذا ما أشار له المسؤولون العسكريون.
The United States is in a state of security and surprise.
We fear this. We fear that they have something out that the majority of the people don't know about.
Olan tüm halkların hakları gibi haklar. Ne aşağı ne yukarı, ne fazla ne az.
Pent-up feelings that may result from decades of repression and people